You're just an ordinary, failed old mechanic who spent 30 years wallowing in grease while saving nothing for my future." My son Julian's voice tore through the hum of the hydraulic lift and shattered the quiet of my auto repair shop like a thrown brick. He didn't just say it to my face, he yelled it at the top of his lungs in front of my young apprentice, in front of a delivery driver, and right in front of his new wife, Courtney, who stood by the glass door looking at my grease-stained overalls with utter disgust. Julian slammed his fist down onto the heavy metal service counter, sending a tray of steel washers scattering across the concrete floor. 30 years working in this filthy pit, Dad, and when I come to you needing $120,000 to save my business from foreclosure, you sit there on your wooden stool and tell me no? You own this commercial lot. You own the house on Elm Street. Sell them. Guarantee my loan. Or do you expect me to go bankrupt while you hoard every nickel for yourself? I didn't yell back. When you've spent 6 years as a chief warrant officer 4 in a combat engineering unit, repairing heavy armor under mortar fire in the dust of Mogadishu, you learn that screaming is what frightened men do when they lose control. I slowly set my wrench down on the workbench and wiped my oil-slicked hands on a shop rag. Before I tell you what happened next, please leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, welcome to Father's Raw Justice channel. Julian let out a bitter, mocking laugh. Look at him. He doesn't even care. His only son is facing financial ruin, and he's just sitting there wiping his hands like a helpless old fool. I care, Julian, I said, my voice low and steady. I care enough to remember that I paid off your full undergraduate tuition at Ohio State. I paid off the $70,000 balance on your business degree when you promised it would give you a fresh start. And 3 years ago, I wrote a $22,000 check when you claimed your wife had emergency medical bills, before I discovered those bills were actually a luxury resort vacation in Cabo. Courtney's face flushed bright red, her manicured hands tightening around her designer handbag. That is completely irrelevant, Mr. Vance. Julian is your only child. You live in a tiny, outdated house, you drive a 20-year-old pickup truck, and you spend virtually nothing. What are you hoarding your wealth for? You can't take this dirt-filled garage to the grave with you. What kind of father lets his son lose his townhouse when you have the equity sitting right beneath your boots? My wife Margaret and I built this shop through 30 years of 60-hour work weeks, Courtney, I replied, turning my gaze to her. This garage pays my apprentice's wage. It pays the supplemental healthcare premiums for 3 retired mechanics who helped me lay the foundation blocks of this building in 1995, and it is not an ATM for high-risk real estate gambles. Julian leaned over the counter until his face was inches from mine, his tailored suit jacket straining across his back, his breath smelling of cold coffee and pure panic. High-risk gambles? I am trying to build a real life, a life of status and respect, not a miserable existence changing oil filters and inhaling exhaust fumes. But you've played it weak your entire life. You've accomplished nothing. You're nobody, Dad. My apprentice, Leo, took a protective step forward from Bay 2, his knuckles white around a breaker bar. Hey, you watch how you talk to Mr. Vance. Shut your mouth, kid, Julian snapped, pointing a trembling finger at Leo. You don't know this old man. He's lived like a pauper his whole life. I went to his house last night while he was at the diner. I used my old key. I searched his desk. I searched his safe, and there is no hidden fortune. Just a couple $1,000s in a checking account. A cold, heavy stillness settled in my chest. You broke into my private desk, Julian? I was looking for my inheritance, Julian screamed, completely unashamed. And do you know what I found? Nothing, except for that heavy olive-drab iron trunk locked under the workbench in the back storage room, the one with the heavy brass padlocks. He turned and pointed toward the dark, narrow hallway leading to the garage's rear storage bay. You've kept that trunk locked my entire life, Julian sneered, a desperate, greedy grin breaking across his face as his delusion took over. You never let Mom touch it. You never let me go near it. That's where it is, isn't it? That's where you've been hiding the cash from this shop for 30 years. You've been skimming off the books and stashing millions in that military trunk. Julian, I said, standing up from my stool, my voice dropping so low it carried a chilling authority that made Courtney take a step back toward the door. You do not want to break those locks. Watch me, Julian spat. He turned, grabbed a 4-foot steel pry bar from the wall rack by the bay door, and marched straight into the dark storage room to force open my past. The deafening metallic screech of steel grinding against hardened steel echoed through every corner of the service bay. My son, Julian, stood over the olive-drab iron trunk in the dark back storage room, his body trembling with a mixture of raw greed and desperation. He swung his entire weight into the 4-foot pry bar, forcing the curved tip under the heavy brass padlock that had kept my military past hidden for nearly 30 years. Outside near the glass doors, Courtney held her designer handbag tight against her chest, her eyes wide with eager anticipation, waiting to see what kind of hidden cash or secret fortune her father-in-law had been hoarding all these years. "Julian, stop!" I called out, my voice cutting cleanly through the dust rising from the storage bay. "You don't know what you're doing. You're violating my privacy and you're opening a door you won't be able to close." "Shut up!" Julian screamed back, his voice breaking as sweat dripped from his forehead onto his expensive navy suit. "You've spent your whole life living like a pauper. Mom told me before she died that you used to sit back here alone at night staring at this trunk. She thought you were hiding money from us. She thought you were saving for something big." "Your mother knew exactly what was inside that trunk, Julian," I said, standing up slowly from my stool and walking toward the back room. "And she supported every single decision I made with it." "You're a liar! You're both liars!" Julian yelled, putting both hands on the pry bar and yanking upward with a guttural roar. Crack! The heavy brass padlock sheared off its shackle, bouncing off the concrete floor with a heavy clatter. The pine framing around the trunk's metal hinges splintered with a sharp groan, and with a heavy shuddering thud, the lid of the dark green Veteran Affairs trunk flew back against the cinder block wall. Julian threw the steel bar aside, dropping to his knees on the cold concrete. He thrust his hands frantically into the dark interior, his fingers clawing through the contents, expecting to feel the rubber-banded stacks of $100 bills or the cold weight of gold bars he had imagined in his head. Instead, his hands met paper, stiff, yellowed, aged paper. What is this?" Julian muttered, his voice suddenly losing its aggressive edge, replaced by a sudden hollow confusion. He pulled out a massive stack of manila folders, bound together by dry rubber bands that snapped the moment his fingers touched them. "Where's the cash, Dad? Where's the off-the-books money from the shop?" "I told you," I said, stopping at the threshold of the storage bay, looking down at him with a mix of sorrow and quiet resolve. "There is no money in that trunk, Julian. There never was." Courtney stepped into the doorway, her high heels clicking nervously. "Julian, look deeper. Check under the blankets. He must have stashed it underneath." Desperate, Julian began dumping the contents onto the garage floor. He threw aside an old woolen military blanket, a faded green field jacket bearing the insignia of a Chief Warrant Officer 4, and a small, velvet-lined wooden case. The wooden case hit the floor and popped open. Resting inside on dark blue velvet was a Silver Star medal, its silk ribbon slightly frayed at the edges, lying right next to a Distinguished Service Cross. Courtney gasped, stepping back a pace, but Julian barely glanced at the medals. His hands grabbed a thick leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked, its pages filled with decades of neat handwritten columns, and flipped it open. "What are these names?" Julian's voice trembled, a sudden wave of panic crashing over his anger. "Who is Marcus Vance? Who is Tyler Miller? Why are there monthly bank transfers listed here going all the way back to 1998? Before I could answer my son, the light coming from the open main bay doors was cut off by two dark shadows. A sleek black government sedan had pulled up beside my service tow truck. Two men in dark tailored suits stepped out. One was a younger man carrying a heavy leather briefcase. The other was an older gentleman with silver hair, wearing a navy blazer adorned with a small discreet pin of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Leo, my apprentice, poked his head out of the office, his eyes wide with worry. Mr. Vance? These gentlemen say they're looking for Chief Warrant Officer Arthur Vance." The silver-haired man walked into the storage bay, his polished leather boots clicking firmly against the concrete floor. He stopped, his sharp eyes instantly taking in the scene. The bent pry bar on the floor, the splintered trunk locks, Courtney standing frozen in the corner, Julian on his knees surrounded by official documents, and me standing quietly with grease on my hands. "Chief Vance?" the silver-haired man asked, his voice resonant and filled with undeniable authority. "I am, sir," I replied, offering a brief, respectful nod. "How can I help you today?" The gentleman extended his hand. "I'm Director Thomas Miller from the Regional Veteran Affairs Office, and this is Special Agent Harris from the VA Inspector General's Office." Julian looked up from the floor, still holding the open ledger, his face pale. Inspector General, wait. Is my father under federal investigation? Did he steal money from the government to run this shop? Director Miller looked down at Julian, his silver eyebrows drawing together in cold, sharp disapproval. He looked at the shattered locks on the military trunk, then at the ledger in Julian's shaking hands. Under investigation? Director Miller said, his tone dropping an octave into a cold, stern rumble. Young man, your father is not under investigation. We are here to deliver the official confirmation of a congressional endowment. Julian blinked, completely lost. A what? For 25 years, Director Miller explained, turning back to look at me with profound, unmistakable respect. Chief Warrant Officer Vance has operated the Sergeant First Class Miller Memorial Scholarship Fund right out of this auto repair shop. He used 40% of his monthly garage profits, along with his entire military disability pension, to fully support the college educations of 14 children whose fathers died under his command during the 1993 deployment. Director Miller took a firm step closer to Julian and pointed directly at the open ledger in my son's hands. Those names you're looking at aren't offshore accounts, and they aren't hidden cash. Those are the sons and daughters of dead soldiers, and your father paid for every single one of their tuition bills, textbooks, and housing without ever taking a single dime of public credit or a single dollar of tax deductions. Julian's face went completely white. Courtney let out a soft sound, covering her mouth with both hands. The heavy leather ledger slipped from Julian's fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a dull, echoing thud. Director Miller reached down, picked the heavy leather-bound ledger off the oil-stained concrete, and carefully wiped a layer of dust from its spine using his blazer sleeve. He set it back inside the open VA trunk, right beside my silver star and the Distinguished Service Cross. Julian didn't move. He remained on his knees, his hands trembling so violently that he had to press them flat against the cold floor to keep them still. Beside him, Courtney backed away until her shoulders hit the doorframe of the storage bay, her face pale, her knuckles white around her designer purse. Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the garage compressor, look at the bottom of the trunk, beneath my old field jacket. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Julian reached into the dark interior. His fingers brushed past the yellowed military records until they touched a single thick cream-colored envelope. The envelope had his name written across the front in gold ink. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, precise, and unmistakable. It was his mother Margaret's handwriting. What? What is this? Julian's voice cracked, barely a whisper. Mom wrote this? 6 years ago, I replied softly, taking a step closer. Right before the cancer took her. She knew you were heading down a dangerous path, Julian. She saw how you looked at money, how you judged people by what they drove, and how ashamed you were that your father spent his life in grease and work boots. Courtney swallowed hard, trying to speak, but Special Agent Harris raised a polite hand, signaling for her to remain quiet. Your mother knew you would eventually run into a wall of your own making, I continued, and she knew that when you did, you wouldn't come to me for advice. You'd come looking for a payout. She made me promise to keep that trunk locked until the day you came to take what you thought was yours. Julian's hand shook so badly he tore the corner of the paper as he broke the wax seal. He pulled out 2 handwritten pages. Tears were already welling in his eyes as he began to read out loud, his voice breaking on every line. My dearest Julian, if you are reading this letter, it means you have broken into your father's military trunk. It means you are facing a crisis of your own creation, and instead of taking responsibility, you came searching for a hidden fortune to save you from your choices. Julian stopped, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, but Director Miller kept his eyes fixed on him, silent and unyielding. Julian forced himself to read on. I know you think your father is just a simple old mechanic who settled for an ordinary life. You see his dirty hands, his old pickup truck, and this quiet garage, and you think he failed to build a legacy? Oh, my sweet boy, you could not be more wrong. A sob escaped Julian's chest, but he couldn't stop reading. Your father carried the weight of 4 fallen brothers on his shoulders for 30 years. When he came back from Mogadishu, he vowed that their sacrifice would not end in dust. He chose to live simply, to drive an old truck, and to work 60 hours a week so that 14 fatherless children would never have to worry about tuition, housing, or textbooks. He gave 14 young people a future. He gave them hope. Julian dropped his head, the letter trembling against his knees. Your father paid for your college, Julian. He paid for your cars, your rent, and your second chances. He fulfilled his duty as a parent. Do not ask him to mortgage his shop or destroy his peace to pay for your vanity. Stand up, son. Stop performing for people who don't care about you, and become the man Arthur raised you to be. Silence fell over the storage room. It was so complete that the only sound was the slow, rhythmic dripping of oil into a catchpan 3 bays over. The arrogance that Julian had carried into my shop, the shouting, the demands for $120,000, the insults about my grease-stained life had been completely stripped away. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, his face ruined by tears and grease. "Dad," Julian whimpered, his voice stripped of every layer of pride. I thought you were hiding money from us. I thought you didn't love me enough to help me." "I loved you enough to build your foundation, Julian," I said, looking straight into his eyes. "But loving you does not mean saving you from your own destruction." Courtney stepped forward, her voice high and panicked. "Mr. Vance, please, you don't understand. The bank is going to take our townhouse. They're going to freeze Julian's assets. If he goes bankrupt, his partners will ruin his reputation. He won't be able to work in finance again." I turned to Courtney, my expression unyielding. "Then he will learn another trade." "You can't do this," she cried out. "You're his father. You have equity in this land. You can sign a guarantee." "I will not sign a second mortgage," I said, setting my jaw. "I will not put this building at risk, and I will not write a single check to cover your $120,000 bad investment." Special Agent Harris stepped up beside Director Miller, pulling a black folder from his briefcase. "And even if CWO Vance wanted to encumber this property, Mrs. Vance, he no longer can." Courtney blinked, her panic momentarily pausing. "What do you mean?" "As of 12 minutes ago," Agent Harris stated with legal precision, "this commercial property, along with the equipment and attached land, has been officially placed under the federal charter of the SFC Miller Scholarship Foundation. Under 38 U.S. Code SS 5301, this property is permanently protected from liens, third-party guarantees, and civil debt collection." Julian looked up from the floor, the full realization crashing down on him. There was no secret cash, there was no equity to steal. There was no legal loophole, no hidden fortune, and no way to force my hand. His entitlement had run headfirst into a wall of federal law and unbreakable military honor. "So," Julian whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at the shattered padlocks on the floor. "That's it? I'm completely on my own?" "You are not on your own, Julian," I replied softly, reaching down and offering him my hand. "I'm still your father. I will sit with you tonight. I will help you find a reputable bankruptcy attorney. I will help you sell your luxury car and help you make a budget." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle into his soul. "But I will not buy your way out of accountability ever again." The silence following Agent Harris's declaration hung over the back bay of Vance Auto Repair like heavy exhaust fumes. Courtney's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound actually came out. Her polished facade, built on country club memberships and designer clothes, crumbled in an instant. She looked at Special Agent Harris, then at Director Miller, and finally at the shattered brass padlocks lying uselessly on the grease-stained concrete. "Protected?" Courtney squeaked, her voice octave higher than normal. "What do you mean protected? You can't just put a private auto repair shop under a federal charter. This property is worth over $800,000. It belongs to Arthur's estate, and Julian is his only living biological heir." Director Miller slowly turned his gaze toward Courtney. The silver-haired VA director didn't raise his voice, but 40 years of military authority resonated in every word he spoke. "Mrs. Vance," Director Miller said quietly, "this building stopped being a simple private asset 23 years ago. When Chief Warrant Officer Vance established the Sergeant First Class Miller Memorial Scholarship Fund in 1998, he signed an irrevocable land use covenant. Every square foot of this garage, including the equipment and the commercial lot on Elm Street, serves as the permanent physical headquarters and funding engine for the foundation." He pointed a steady finger toward the open ledger sitting inside the green VA trunk. "Under Federal Statute 38 U.S. Code Section 55301, Director Miller continued. Any property or account designated to fund benefits for the surviving dependents of fallen service members is fully exempt from civil claims, third-party liens, personal guarantees, and bankruptcy attachments. You could hire every corporate attorney in the state of Ohio, Mrs. Vance, and not a single one of them could touch a single brick of this building. Julian remained on his knees, his mother Margaret's handwritten letter still clutched in his trembling fingers. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at the federal agents. He stared directly at the concrete floor, right where the grease from a 30-year-old Chevrolet truck had soaked into the stone. You gave it all away, Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a hollow mixture of disbelief and utter defeat. 30 years of dirty hands, 30 years of fixing brake pads and changing oil filters, and you gave every single dime to strangers? I stepped out of the storage bay threshold and stood directly over my son. I reached down, took him by his upper arm, and pulled him up from the cold floor. He didn't fight me. His body was limp, all the fight and arrogance drained out of him. They weren't strangers, Julian, I said, looking straight into his bloodshot eyes. Sergeant First Class Miller was 32 years old when a mortar shell hit our engineering post in Mogadishu. He shielded 3 junior enlisted men with his own body. He left behind a 26-year-old widow and 2 twin girls who were 4 months old. Master Sergeant Davis died holding a hydraulic line intact so our recovery vehicle could haul 8 wounded soldiers out of an ambush. He had a 5-year-old boy who spent the next 10 years asking why his daddy never came home. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a harsh, steady whisper. I made the promise to those men while I was wiping their blood off my armor, I told him. I promised them that as long as I had breath in my lungs and strength in my hands, their children would never have to beg for a future. I spent 30 years fixing cars in this pit so that 14 kids could walk across college graduation stages without a single dollar of student debt. Julian swallowed hard, a fresh tear cutting a clean line through the dust on his cheek. And what about my future, Dad? What about me? I gave you your future, Julian, I replied firmly. I paid every penny of your tuition at Ohio State. I bought your first car. I bailed you out of your first failed business venture. I gave you a clean slate, an education, and a father who loved you enough to tell you the truth. But instead of building a life on that foundation, you spent 10 years trying to look rich to impress people who don't care if you live or die. Courtney stepped toward the door, her heels clicking rapidly against the pavement as she pulled out her smartphone. Julian, we're leaving. We're calling a real lawyer right now. This whole thing is ridiculous. They can't do this to us. Julian didn't move. He looked at his wife, then at the expensive phone in her hand, and finally at the worn paper of his mother's letter. Stop it, Courtney, Julian said, his voice flat and exhausted. What? She gasped, staring at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Julian, your townhouse goes into default in 3 days. If we don't secure a guarantee on this property, the bank is going to freeze our personal accounts by Friday. Then let them freeze them, Julian said quietly. He folded his mother's letter carefully along its original creases and slid it into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket right over his heart. There is no guarantee, Courtney. There is no hidden money. My father isn't going to save us. Are you insane? Courtney yelled, her composure completely shattering. We're going to lose the car. We're going to lose the club membership. My family will find out. Julian looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the very first time since they had married 18 months ago. He saw the cold, sharp panic in her eyes, not panic because her husband was hurting, but panic because her luxury lifestyle was evaporating. My mother was right, Julian said softly, gesturing toward the green VA trunk. I chose shortcuts. I surrounded myself with people who only cared about what I could buy them. Courtney's eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. If you go bankrupt, Julian, I'm not staying around to watch you pull yourself out of the mud. I didn't marry a mechanic's son to live in a rented apartment. Then you should probably call an Uber, Courtney, Julian replied quietly, turning his back on her, because I'm not driving you home. The sound of Courtney's high heels clicking angrily away down the concrete walkway faded into the late afternoon quiet, followed by the violent slam of a luxury car door and the screech of tires pulling out of the parking lot. Julian didn't turn around to watch her go. He stood frozen near the threshold of the storage bay, staring down at the concrete floor as if he'd forgotten how to walk. His tailored suit jacket was wrinkled, his silk tie loosened, and his thumbs absently stroked the edges of his late mother Margaret's letter, which he had tucked carefully into his front breast pocket. Director Miller and Special Agent Harris remained by the workbench, discreetly reviewing the federal charter documents. My apprentice, Leo, stood silently in Bay 2, holding a torque wrench, completely awestruck by what he had just witnessed. "She's right about one thing, Dad," Julian said, his voice flat, completely stripped of the razor-sharp arrogance he had brought into my garage 2 hours ago. "The hard money lender isn't going to wait. The foreclosure notice on the townhouse hits the public records at 8:00 a.m. on Friday. By noon, my personal credit line gets frozen. My partners at the investment firm will officially vote to remove me from the partnership by the end of the week." He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, searching my face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the old father who used to sign checks whenever he ran into trouble. "I have $84,000 in immediate short-term liquid obligations," Julian whispered, swallowing hard, "and $46,000 in personal guarantees that are going into default. If I can't cover at least part of it, I'm facing personal bankruptcy before the month is over." I didn't reach for my checkbook. I didn't offer to mortgage my house on Elm Street, and I didn't offer to give him a loan from the garage checking account. Instead, I picked up a clean shop towel from the dispenser by the sink, walked over to my son, and handed it to him. "Wipe your face, Julian," I said, my voice calm, steady, and unyielding. "You're bleeding grease and sweat under your expensive shirt." Julian took the towel with trembling hands and wiped his forehead. "Are you really going to let me go bankrupt, Dad? After everything?" "I'm going to let you face the reality of the choices you made," I replied, looking him dead in the eye. "For 10 years, Julian, I watched you spend money you didn't have to impress people who didn't care about you. Every time you ran into a wall, you expected me to cushion the impact. You thought that because I chose to live quietly and work with my hands, my life was just a safety net waiting to catch you whenever you leaped without looking." "I was trying to build a career," Julian yelled, a momentary flash of his old defensiveness flaring up before instantly dying down under my stare. I thought success meant having things to show people." "Success is what remains when the performance is over," I told him, gesturing toward the main bay where his sleek $60,000 imported sports car was parked in the driveway. "You drive a car that costs more than my annual living expenses, yet you come to a Thome to pay your credit cards. That isn't success, son. That's an illusion." Director Miller stepped forward, carrying a black leather portfolio containing the finalized congressional endowment papers. "Chief Vance," Director Miller said quietly, his tone carrying the deep, unshakable dignity of a senior military officer. "Special Agent Harris and I have verified the charter boundaries. The SFC Miller Scholarship Foundation is officially locked under federal protection. No bank, no creditor, and no legal claim can ever touch this shop or its assets. Your 25 years of silent duty are legally sealed." Director Miller placed the open portfolio on the workbench, handing me a heavy silver pen. I leaned over the counter and signed my name at the bottom of the federal charter. "Arthur Vance, Chief Warrant Officer 4, retired." Julian watched the ink dry on the paper. He didn't ask for a percentage. He didn't ask if there was any loophole left. The presence of the federal agents, the weight of his mother's letter over his heart, and the cold reality of his financial collapse had finally broken through his entitlement. "So what do I do now?" Julian asked, his voice cracking as he looked at his hands that had never known a day of hard manual labor. "My wife is leaving me, my firm is firing me, and I'm going to lose my car and my home by Friday." "You do what any man does when his structure collapses," I said, placing a heavy, grease-calloused hand on his shoulder. "You clean up the rubble, and you start rebuilding from the ground up." "How?" he whimpered, looking utterly lost. "First," I said, pointing toward the driveway, "you hand the keys of that sports car over to a private buyer or a liquidation dealership today. You take whatever equity is left in it and you hand it straight to your primary lender to buy yourself 60 days of negotiation time." Julian blinked, looking at his car outside. "That car is the only thing I have left that makes me look." "It makes you look like a man drowning in debt," I interrupted firmly. "Sell the car, Julian. Take the bus. Move into a simple one-bedroom apartment, hire a reputable bankruptcy attorney who will help you execute a structured Chapter 13 reorganization instead of running away from your creditors. Julian stared at me for a long, silent moment. The realization settled in. There was no rescue, no check, no magical inheritance. But for the first time in his life, there was a clear, honest path forward, one that required him to carry his own weight. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his leather key fob, and looked at it. Then, with a slow, heavy breath, he nodded. "Okay," Julian whispered, his shoulders dropping in surrender. "Okay, I'll call the dealership." Julian stood by the passenger door of his sleek silver sports car parked outside the garage bay, his fingers hovering over the leather key fob. 10 minutes ago, he had made the phone call. A local liquidation auto dealership had agreed to send a transport flatbed to pick up the vehicle, offering him $32,000 in immediate cash equity to wire directly to his primary lender. It wasn't enough to settle his entire $120,000 debt, but it was enough to halt the Friday foreclosure proceedings on his townhouse and buy him 60 critical days to execute a structured bankruptcy filing. Courtney was long gone, having taken a rideshare back to the city after declaring that her marriage wasn't built for a life without country club memberships or high-end dining. Julian pressed the button on the key fob. The headlights flashed twice, a soft chirp cutting through the evening air, signaling the car was unlocked for the transport driver. He walked back inside the main garage, his designer suit coat folded over his forearm, his white dress shirt stained with grease around the cuffs. Director Miller and Special Agent Harris were standing near the workbench, waiting for the ink on the federal charter to dry. Leo was quietly wiping down the hydraulic lifts, keeping his distance to give us privacy. "The flatbed will be here in 20 minutes, Julian said, his voice flat, completely hollowed out of the aggressive arrogance he had carried when he slammed his briefcase down 2 hours ago. I gave them instructions to wire the equity directly to the lender's escrow account. That was a hard choice, Julian, I said, setting my favorite wrench down beside the newly signed congressional charter. But it was the right one. It's just metal and leather, Julian muttered, looking down at his polished shoes, which were now scuffed and marked with black oil from the floor. I spent 4 years paying $600 a month for a car just so people I barely knew would think I was important. Today, I sold it to pay interest on a mistake. Director Miller stepped forward, picking up the heavy black leather portfolio containing the finalized federal charter. He extended his hand to me. Chief Warrant Officer Vance, Director Miller said, his voice carrying the deep, unshakable respect of one veteran speaking to another. The Department of Veterans Affairs officially recognizes your 25 years of selfless service to the families of Sergeant First Class Miller, Master Sergeant Davis, and the 12 other children funded under this trust. Your garage, your land, and your quiet sacrifice are now permanently recorded in the congressional record. Thank you, Director, I replied, shaking his hand firmly. I only did what any team leader would do for the men who didn't get to come home. Special Agent Harris closed his briefcase with a sharp click. Mrs. Vance, or anyone else, will find that this property is completely unassailable by civil courts or private collection agencies under 38 U.S. Code SS 5301. Your legacy, Chief Vance, is fully protected. With a final, respectful nod, the two VA officials walked out to their black government sedan, its engine turning over smoothly as they pulled away into the late afternoon Columbus traffic. The silence that returned to the shop was heavy, but it wasn't cold. It was the quiet of a storm that had finally passed, leaving behind clear air and bare ground. Julian walked slowly into the back storage bay. He looked at the dark green VA trunk resting under the workbench. The brass padlocks were broken, their shackles lying on the concrete, and the lid was propped open, revealing the yellowed military ledgers, the silver star medal, and the empty envelope that had held his mother Margaret's final letter. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out the letter, and smoothed it against his chest before placing it gently back inside the trunk, right on top of my old Army field jacket. I called you a failed mechanic, Dad, Julian whispered, his back turned to me. I stood in front of your apprentice and told you that you saved nothing for my future. You were looking at the world through numbers on a screen, Julian, I said, walking into the storage bay and standing beside him. When you measure a man by his bank account, you miss everything that actually holds a life together. I lost my wife today, Julian said, his shoulders dropping as tears finally brimmed in his eyes. I'm going to lose my firm, and by next month, I'll probably be living in a rented studio apartment. You didn't lose a wife, Julian. You lost an audience, I told him gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. And as for your firm and your apartment, those are just walls and titles. You can build new ones. But this time, you build them on your own strength, not on borrowed money or someone else's sacrifice. Julian looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, searching my face. Can I ever fix this, Dad? Can I ever earn back your respect? Respect isn't something you buy back with a check, son, I replied. You build it through 100 ordinary, honest days in a row. You show up when things are quiet. You tell the truth when it costs you something. And you stop expecting other people to pay for your mistakes. Outside, the yellow lights of the flatbed transport truck pulled into the driveway to haul away Julian's sports car. Julian watched through the dirty garage window as the driver loaded the vehicle onto the ramp. He didn't rush out to take one last photo. He didn't complain. He simply watched it go, accepting the reality of the boundary I had set and accepting that his life was finally his own to repair. He turned back toward me and took a slow, deep breath. I should get to the bus stop. I have a meeting with a bankruptcy attorney at 7 tomorrow morning. Julian? I called out just as he reached the pedestrian exit door. He stopped, his hand resting on the metal frame, and looked back over his shoulder. Come back Sunday morning, I said quietly. The wooden fence behind the shop needs 3 new posts, and the hydraulic oil on the tow truck needs to be drained and replaced. I could use an extra pair of hands. A small, tired, but genuine smile touched the corners of my son's mouth, the first real smile I had seen on his face in years. I'll be here at 7 sharp, Dad, Julian said, and I'll wear old clothes. After the flatbed drove away and my son walked down the sidewalk toward the city bus stop, I walked into the storage room one last time. I picked up a new brass padlock from my workbench, snapped it securely into the iron clasp of the green VA trunk, and locked my past safely away. Leo turned off the main bay lights, leaving only the warm glow of the workbench lamp illuminating the clean concrete. The smell of gear oil, old iron, and hard work filled the air, the same smell that had greeted me every morning for 34 years. What do you believe is the true measure of a man's legacy? The wealth he accumulates for himself, or the quiet sacrifices he makes to give others a future? If my story reminded you that true character cannot be bought, please share your thoughts in the comments below.